Awesome. Thank you so much, Max. All right. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very excited to welcome you all on the line. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. Everyone who joins is automatically muted as the default. We ask that you please stay muted during the duration of this webinar, but we do have a Q&A session at the very end. And throughout the webinar, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. And during the Q&A session, you can also use the raise hand function and also come off chat during that time to ask your question. So again, thank you all for joining us for our Clean Water Policy 101 Lunch and Learn. I am very privileged to be joining my colleague Ayana Simba, City Programs Director at the Illinois Environmental Council. My name is Angela Shu, and I am the Municipal Engagement Manager. So to begin, we will just do a little bit about IEC as an organization. We'll go over an overview of our water policy program, a who's who of our stakeholders. Then we'll go into some of our issue areas, including flooding, lead service line replacement, PFAS, water access, and affordability. And then again, a Q&A at the very end. So the Illinois Environmental Council was founded in 1975. We work to safeguard Illinois, its people, plants, and animals, and the natural systems on which all life depends by building power for people and the environment. We do work in 6 different issue areas, including agriculture, conservation, clean energy, transportation, clean water, and zero waste. And we do our work through coalition building, through legislator education, and policy advocacy. We do have over 150 different affiliate organization members, and our list can be found online. And these all vary in a wide spectrum of organizational sizes, budgets, staffing size, and capacities. Our geographic scope is all within Illinois. We work with national, regional, and community-based orgs, as well as civic institutions. There are a few benefits of being an affiliate of IEC, including, for example, we have our policy staff expertise right there available to you. We do movement building, legislative leadership. We provide office resources as well as communication support. And we can also help to inform on strategy and policy agendas. So why 101s? Well, we want to share what we do with you all. We want to share greater knowledge in all of these 6 issue areas, today being clean water. And we do have recordings of our past 101s on our YouTube. And if you want to keep in touch with us and stay up to date on what's going on, we do have a sign up email listserv on our website, as well as more information to come at the end of this webinar. All right, and with that, I will pass it over to Ayana.
Cool. Thanks for the wonderful introduction, Angela, and giving us a recap of IEC's work. Hi, everyone. Ayana Simba, City Programs Director with the Illinois Environmental Council. I'm going to talk about a few water issues that IEC that we're engaged in. But before we get into the specific issues, I just want to talk a little bit about what funding and governance for water infrastructure looks like in Illinois. So to no surprise, like a lot of other infrastructure areas, funding for water infrastructure has been falling since the 1970s. And so that is a lot of the impact of that has been exacerbated by the impacts of climate change, where we see water infrastructure fail every day, when we see flooding in people's basements, or we see combined sewer overflows, or we see lead in drinking water. A lot of those things, really the source is lack of funding. As far as more like how funding is overseen. So the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency oversees the state revolving funds. So this is essentially money that comes from the federal government. Every year that money is then given to states. And in the case of Illinois, IEPA oversees it. They put it into drinking water and clean water SRF. So drinking water being like lead, drinking water infrastructure broadly, and clean water. So things referring to like maybe like water reclamation districts would apply for clean water SRFs. So things that apply to funding, things that apply to flooding, things like that. Other sources of water funding are WIFIA. So there's direct grants or loans that you can municipalities or water utilities can apply for straight from the federal government. And then, of course, some less favorites are taxes, bonds, and water rate increases. Next slide, please. So water supply in Illinois, there are about roughly 1,700 water suppliers. One thing to note is that population-wise, yes, majority of Illinois gets its water from Lake Michigan because the majority of our population is in the Northeast. However, the rest of the state, a majority of the water comes from groundwater. And in other cases, it might also be surface water, so things like the Kankakee River or Lake Springfield. And then federal and state laws related to this are really based on the water source. So drinking water, for example, really relates to water that comes from the tap. Surface water is relating more to like rivers and smaller lakes. And then groundwater is related to aquifers. And in these cases, there are different federal and state laws that pertain to these different water sources. And as far as oversight in Illinois, it's a little bit murky when it comes to public and municipal ran water utilities. And by municipal and public, I mean, for example, like the Chicago Department of Water Management. It is not an investor-owned water supply. It's not a company. It is ran by the city of Chicago. Um, they are overseeing the laws that sort of pertain to these folks are withdrawals from Lake Michigan, so overseen by the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. But for a broad swath of policies that do have an impact, so things like, you know, water shutoff, water rates, and other policies, there isn't really a clear central body in Illinois that's overseeing all of those things. And I also didn't include on here, but things like lead pipe replacement, those are overseen by the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. And then as far as private water utilities, so like American Water, Aqua Illinois, they're overseen by the Illinois Commerce Commission. And then people who have individual private wells, there are some laws underneath the IPA that have some general oversight over those wells. So how does all this end up manifesting? So as I mentioned before, you know, there's a lack of oversight, especially for public ran water utilities or municipal ran water utilities. And even with the case of having more governance over private water utilities, having a fractured governance manifests into these really big problems. So we have things like unaffordable water. We had water rate increases during the pandemic. The pandemic is probably what really highlighted one of those issues is that you know, the state decided to issue a water shutoff moratorium. This can only apply to private water utilities, which only cover a minority of water utilities here in Illinois. Poor infrastructure and contaminated water, wells that run dry. So when you have a lack of oversight, you know, you get water mismanagement. You get wells that run dry because there's not a central body that's adequately overseeing how water is being used. And then political quarrels. So when you have mismanagement of municipal funds, those things can all translate into poor water infrastructure. And I think even from a longer term perspective, with Illinois being situated along a Great Lake, as we get further and further into climate change, we know that people and businesses are going to start returning to the Great Lakes. And so we want to make sure we have proper oversight in order to protect a very, very precious and will become an increasingly valuable resource. I sort of mentioned these folks already, IPA, IDNR, when it comes to wastewater treatment, your local water reclamation districts, municipal water utilities, private water utilities, and then as far as advocacy, I want to give a huge shout out to the Illinois Water Justice Coalition, IEC, along with the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, run a coalition of about 20 different organizations across the state that focus on water issues here in Illinois. So now I'll jump into our first issue area. So with flooding, as we all know, climate change is causing more frequent and intense storms. Flooding events that may have happened once in a decade are now happening multiple times a decade. And in some cases, huge flooding events that are happening twice in the same year. A good portion of Illinois is subjected to flooding. So we have a huge system of rivers, lakes, and streams in Illinois, which is great and it's a resource, but it also puts us at greater risk of flooding. And then heavier rain, you know, can harm water quality. So in the example of rural flooding, this can lead to, you know, nutrient runoff. In urban settings, this can lead to combined sewer overflows. It also can lead to water backing up into people's homes, people being exposed to untreated water. And then it just puts a stress on the Illinois economy. So when we talk about rural flooding, we're thinking about things like damage to crops, unplanted crops, agricultural runoff. I'll give the example of May 2019. At the time, it was, and I believe it's still the case, was the third wettest May on record. This forced farmers to leave millions of soybeans and corn acres unplanted. So that's an economic impact. At the urban level, you have homes and businesses that are flooded. A good portion of businesses that are flooded tend to not reopen. And then just the financial damage of just the financial damage to infrastructure whenever we have these really huge flooding events. So as far as some solutions, we need to invest in both gray and green infrastructure. So building more pipes is great and wonderful, but we also need to think about strategically using what nature has provided us. So thinking of how do we not only plant more trees, but how do we protect trees, these large mature trees that can soak up water? How do we plant native plants strategically? Things like that, updating the Illinois floodplain maps, and then just being more conscious in our planning. Where are we putting non-porous surfaces at? How can we have more green space incorporated into wherever we're building, uh, wherever there's new development. So a few solutions or policy changes that have come up. So this past session, Senator Ellman had introduced a bill that would establish a permanent state water plan task force. So the state passed adopted a new state water plan, I believe at the end of 2022. And that basically will guide agency action funding and legislation. So having a permanent task force is really important as far as ensuring that that plan does not just sit on the shelf. And then some other funding policies that I'll mention two of them: transportation, flood insurance, and the flood climate safe housing are both ones that we've worked on, but unfortunately did not pass this session, but we'll continue to work on. And then I do want to mention the landlord tenant flood disclosure. So this requires landlords to notify tenants if there is a significant flooding hazard for that property. And in the case that it does end up flooding and the landlord has not notified them, people can even go as far as to bring action against the landlord. And then just generally, a tenant can also terminate their lease or receive rent reimbursement as well. So that was a huge victory, and we passed that, and we're looking forward to that being signed into law. Switching gears here to lead service line replacement. So as folks already know, there's no safe level of lead in drinking water. While the EPA does have an action level, that's specifically about when a municipality has, or not a municipality, when a water supplier has to take action, but that is not referring to what is safe for everyday people. Can't see or smell or taste lead. Where you're most likely going to see it is single family homes built before 1986. And this is really because the sizing of the lead pipe, there's a limit. So if you live in, for example, a 12-story building with 100 units, it is very highly unlikely that you're going to have a lead pipe because there's physical limitations to the size of lead pipes. And then homes that are built before 2000 have some internal lead in it too likely. Illinois, we have 1/8 of all the lead service lines in the country. There are around 392, anywhere to 400,000 in Chicago alone. We have 350,000 children that are at risk of lead poisoning because of this. And we know that communities of color face a greater risk of lead exposure in Illinois. And as you can see in the diagram, the impacts of lead on the body are not great. It can impact, the reproductive system, your kidneys, cognitive thinking, really critical areas of human body. And this just so people fully understand where lead is coming from. So when you have that source of water, so this, for example, is Flint, the Flint River, and this is about Flint, Michigan, but whether your water is coming from Lake Michigan or coming from an aquifer, that water is sent to the treatment plant, it goes out through the water mains. Up until that point, there is no lead in the water. There's not lead in that water. What ends up happening is you get that lead pipe that connects the water from the water main into the home. That is where you have the interaction with lead. And so any disturbances to that lead service line can basically shake up that coating that's put in there to stop from lead from leaching into water. And once that coating is disturbed, lead enters the water, and that's when you have the problem. That's when people end up having lead in their drinking water. And it's part of the reason why we will need to replace lead pipes, because the just using phosphate coating is not going to be, it's not enough to prevent people from being exposed to lead in their water. Policy wise, there's a few different ones. There's legacy ones like the Safe Drinking Water Act. The lead and copper rule is currently being updated from the 2020 version and expected to be released sometime this fall. And then we also have 15 million for lead pipe replacement in Illinois. And then we passed the Lead Service on Replacement and Notification Act in 2021. It was a huge victory. It basically requires all water suppliers to come up with a plan to track or to identify and replace lead pipes. Further, we need to speed up lead pipe replacement, especially for high risk areas. So thinking about daycare centers and communities that are exposed to lead through other avenues, such as in the air or through soil. And then we need to make sure we need to be able to practically subsidize the lead service line replacement. It can cost anywhere from $3,000 to $25,000 to replace a lead pipe. That is extremely unaffordable for most Illinoisans, and people did not ask for lead pipes to be installed. Therefore, they shouldn't have to be on the hook for the full cost of replacing them. And with all things, we need more federal money. Okay, recognizing time, trying to move us along a little bit here on to PFAS. So this is something that has really come up recently, a lot of, and just in the regular conversations. I have family members that are not engaged in environmental issues that know about PFAS, but essentially this is a large group of man-made chemicals. They're in products that you can find everywhere, and really what makes them really useful. So things like being resistant to water is also what makes them really problematic. So they accumulate in water, soil, and our food, ended up bioaccumulating in our bodies over time. So exposure to it can lead to things like thyroid disorders. And recently during the COVID-19 pandemic, it was talked about because it does have a certain negative effect on the efficacy of vaccines. Where you're going to find it at, you're going to find it at military bases, airports, fire stations, landfills, places where they used to manufacture PFAS products that contain PFAS chemicals. There are several sites throughout Illinois. However, IPA did do a testing and found that only a small percentage of community water supplies had detectable levels of PFAS. So solutions, personally, there are things you can do. So just avoid using products that contain PFAS. It's probably the easiest thing that you can do. If you really, really want to go far, you can always get a water filter that's designed to remove PFAS. And then there are other things like dusting household surfaces regularly, things of those matter. But as far as policy, I'm not going to read all these things on the screen, but I am going to talk about the PFAS Reduction Act of 2021 that, again, a major victory. So basically this phases out the use of PFAS containing firefighting foam. I had mentioned on the last slide that a lot of these sources where they're like huge sources of PFAS relate to airports or firefighting stations because PFAS containing firefighting foam is often used in military testing, and it's very useful for situations where you have very highly flammable liquids. So that was a huge victory for us to be able to phase that out. And now we're looking to try to establish a PFAS firefighting foam take back program. A few other ordinances, a few other bills that we proposed this year. A handful of them requiring monitoring water, registry for PFAS contained products, and then just an outright ban of sale for PFAS for products that contain PFAS. All those things did not pass this session, unfortunately, but we continue to work on them. And then at the national level, EPA, the US EPA in April did issue drinking water standards for a handful of PFAS chemicals. States have, or water suppliers have about 3 years to comply with that. So that's all to say that in Illinois, there's going to be a lot more conversation around PFAS. We have the 21.8 million allocated, but we're going to need a lot more funding for that. And then I will pass it over to Angela to talk about water access and affordability.
Thank you so much, Ayana. Yeah, so this is an area in water policy that we are starting to work on as municipal water access and affordability. So to set the stage, there are several Great Lakes cities. As you all know, Chicago is definitely one of them, and they're all affected by aging and inefficient water infrastructure, as well as the decreasing federal and state dollars that have basically forced public water utilities to push these operations and maintenance costs onto the residents. So high water bills will especially burden low income and minority households and lead to water shutoffs. We're aware that the city of Chicago's Department of Water Management did issue numerous water shutoff notices over the past decade. And a lot of these were actually in the 5 zip codes with the highest poverty rate. And denied access to water means health and social economic consequences, especially during the pandemic. And if there's no oversight, that means we also don't understand the scope of the problem. So water transparency, especially water rate transparency, is important. And we want to know, how does this affect all of these rates? And this is an ongoing project at IEC to find out more information. In 2021, the Illinois General Assembly commissioned UIC to conduct a water rate setting study covering the Lake Michigan Service Area, or LMSA. And we wanted to do a quick shout out to our intern who just ended her internship with us, Sarah. She did some great work in providing this analysis of the study. The study focused on residential water rates, used a standardized water bill, and this is equal to the price that residents pay for 5,000 gallons per 1 month, and offered by the city of Chicago. And so this map illustrates that region in the light yellow on the right side there. Now, water bills have increased by an average of 22.5% from 2014 to 2020. The average water bill is $45, and disadvantaged communities do face challenges such as higher operational costs, a lack of access to loans, and greater infrastructure needs. 172 municipalities rely on Lake Michigan water, and 12 of these municipalities directly pump it from the lake, while 160 of them purchase Lake Michigan water. And as you can see, the municipalities that directly pump water from the lake actually have a lower median standardized rate compared to the higher median standardized water rate for purchasing it. There is a rate setting process that we had looked into. It first starts with municipal staff review. So looking at the historic operating costs, the expenditures, whether current expenditures or debt service, looking at wholesale price changes, benchmarking to similar communities. And there's a lot of variation in this review. And then it goes to a third-party engagement and review of the rate type. So when we talk about third-party engagement, we're talking about consulting a water rate study, consulting the use of proprietary software, engaging with staff and consultants, and estimating upcoming capital expenses. And when we talk about the types of rates, we're talking about it's either fixed, which means a flat or same regardless of the usage rate, volumetric, which means it's based on the measured use of the water, or there's a combination of the two, both flat and volumetric. So you have a base charge and then adding a volumetric rate based on the actual usage. The next step is then looking at a proposed rate change. So looking at how proposed change may or may not be presented for approval. And then a council or water board then approves that rate based on the structure of municipal government. And it often coincides with the overall budget process. And then the last step is to establish the new rate in the municipal code and the ordinances. And so there are some solutions, and I will pass it over to Ayana to talk about these.
Thanks, Angela. So yeah, we did at one point have the National Low Income Household Water Assistance Program, which was really effective in providing basically funding that folks could use towards water debt. So either for wastewater or water for their water bill. And unfortunately, the funding for that program ended at the end of 2023, and they're no longer accepting applications. There are some bills proposed at the federal level for a permanent national water assistance program, which I honestly think is greatly needed. The program had been proven to be pretty effective, especially for people who, again, are struggling to pay other bills to have some type of temporary relief. And then there is the existing Chicago Utility Billing Relief Program, which does provide a 50% discount on water bills and provides water debt wipeout. So I just want to highlight these programs because they're really effective in not only just helping people pay their bills month to month or however it's being charged, but also wiping out debt, which for a lot of people, it's surprisingly a really big problem. But I'm gonna go to the next slide, please. Thank you. However, I want to be clear that water assistance does not equal water affordability. So what we really need, we need more transparent policies about how water rates are being set. We need water rate restructure. So we tried to do vernacular water rates back in 2019. Haven't really revisited that yet, especially since the pandemic. But it's a conversation we need to talk more about and thinking about how different users of the system should pay their fair share. So how can we, industrial users, they probably shouldn't be paying the same rate as your individual household. So there are things to discuss more about as far as water rate restructure, but there's greater long-term water affordability solutions that we need to look to besides just assistance programs. So I wanted to kick off the Q&A session. I know some folks had some questions in the chat, which I'll go through, but I do encourage people to continue adding questions in the chat or using the raise your hand function. So let me see. Okay, Jeffrey, I see your, should I not have carpeting because of PFAS? No, so really what this is referring to is stain resistant carpeting. I'm not a homeowner, so I'm not in the market for buying carpet. So I can't say whether or not that's a majority of carpet out there. I'm assuming it is, but honestly, just the next time you go to replace carpet in your home, maybe thinking about purchasing carpet that doesn't contain PFAS. Let me see. Um, Would love a low-level explanation of how having to combine sewer impacts water treatment plants. I struggle to explain this to people who don't have prior background, but it's difficult to articulate the point. Conserve water on action. Yes. Okay, so when there's huge rainstorms, like what we had, what is it, Saturday? At least here in Chicago. Sorry for downstate folks, but what we had here, basically what ends up happening is that a lot of cities, especially historical cities, have a combined sewer system. So it's taking treated water that's not only coming from the tap, but also taking just sewage water and taking water that's running off in the street into this single system. When it rains a bunch, it overwhelms the system. And so the worst that happens is that ends up going into people's homes and it also ends up going back into bodies of water. So in the case of Chicago, that's the Lake Michigan. So when people, and you might hear this, for example, like MWD will say, try to conserve your water. Please don't use, please try not to shower during this time or run your dishwasher, etc. Because that water, again, is all going towards the same system. So you're essentially adding to the water that's in the system and contributing to the problem, just to be honest. But that is like my best way of explaining it. I'm not a water treatment plant professional by any means, but I've put on enough tours and that's my understanding of it. What grant opportunities exist to help homeowners to replace with the replacement of lead pipes? So it really depends on your municipality or your water supply or your private water supplier. I would first just check with the municipality if you have a municipal ran water utility and ask them where can I get some assistance depending on where you're at. Chicago has multiple lead pipe replacement programs. So there's one that's like a homeowner initiated where they just take off, I think like $3,500 as far as permit fees. There's one that's based on your income that can provide full lead service line replacement for free. So I would just check with your water utility. And then I saw a note about the abbreviations. So in the slides, I do spell out the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, it's IDNR, or the State Revolving Funds is SRF. That's on the slides, and these will be sent out following today's webinar. Do folks have more questions? Also, again, welcome people to come off mute if that's easier than having to type everything out. Let's see. When I hear about estimated cost of lead pipe replacement, it's striking as inflated and could be done less expensively. Yes, yes, yes. It's the same thing that advocates are saying that we've been bothering the city of Chicago about for a long time because it seems insane that it could cost almost $25,000 to replace a lead pipe. So agreeing with you, Jeffrey, and the excuses that, or the reasoning that we've received is that for permitting costs or in larger cities where there's complex infrastructure underneath the surface, there's more care and consideration and thus more financial costs. And that's why it can be very expensive to replace the pipes. That's what we've heard. Sophia, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. This is kind of hard to articulate over chat. So with the combined sewer system situation, and maybe I'm like fully not understanding this correctly, but is it ever like considered not, obviously not like deadly, but not super safe maybe to swim in the lake during this time? I know like some people in other Great Lakes cities, they say that they actually do receive action alerts or sort of like public public health warnings, like, hey, don't maybe don't swim in the lake today. And I know that in Chicago we have options where we could subscribe to something like that, like subscribe to like a text warning. But I'm wondering why this isn't just like a public warning. It's just kind of concerning when I see like beaches super packed and crowded after we have these rain events.
Yes. So in the case of Chicago, like I'm sure you know the history that the river doesn't run into Lake Michigan anymore. We had a reverse, and now we contribute to a bunch of issues down in the Gulf Coast. But beyond that, so when it comes to Lake Michigan, we have these combined sewer overflow events. Really, the water quality that's being impacted is the Chicago River itself, and so there will be to your point though, it's not like necessarily like a warning that's going out to everyone's phone and that you can sign up to find that out. But there will be a warning of like, hey, there was a combined sewer overflow event. We advise folks not to go kayaking or swimming or any type of recreation in the Great Lake in the river for X amount of time. The Lake Michigan is generally protected from this, except for really, really extreme rain events where they will have to actually open up the Chicago River to open up the Chicago River. Sorry, the best way to explain it is that they can basically open up gates that allow for the Chicago River to backflow somewhat into Lake Michigan. And that's the case where you will get warnings about do not swim on the beach, but generally those don't apply to beaches here in Chicago. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.